to the traveling actors troupe for stopping by our church this morning to read this strange and unfamiliar story from the book of Judges. Now, as many of you know, our project of reading through the whole Bible together as a church led us this past week to the books of Judges and Ruth. And if I'm being perfectly honest with you, these are not the most important, or shall we say, highlighted books in the biblical story. Of course, they're all important. They all play a role in weaving together the story as a whole, but some are simply more defining than others. If, for example, we compared the Bible to a popular song that you might hear on the radio, then you could suggest that many of its major episodes are the verses that it sings. There is a verse about the creation, another verse about the Exodus, another verse about the receiving of the law. But these events aren't just described in back-to-back fashion. The Bible tries to give you a continuous narrative, including the transitions between them. Now, in music, we might call this a musical bridge that takes us from one verse to another. And I would encourage us to think of the book of Judges as a kind of bridge that brings us between two of the major events in the Bible. One of them being the conquest of the land of Israel that we heard about last week in the book of Joshua, and the other one being the united monarchy under Saul, especially David and Solomon. Now, these are two events that stick out in the memories of Jewish and Christian people as being extremely important. They set the model for what kind of peoples we wanted to be, what the people of God might look like at their best. In between them, we have this period that is sometimes called the age or the time of the Judges. But I actually don't think it's really accurate or helpful to even refer to it as the time of the Judges, because that gives the impression that there's just kind of this continuous leadership that's going on from Moses and Joshua on the one side to David and Solomon on the other, with figures like Deborah and Gideon and Samson taking the mantle in between. Don't get me wrong, these figures are important judges, important figures in the book of Judges, but they don't have the same kind of authority. There's not the same kind of community in this book as we have in those other sections. In fact, the political situation in Judges is generally summarized in one of the verses that Angie read for us from Judges 17:6, which people consider to be the summary statement of the entire book, which says, "In those days, there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes." So the emphasis here is that there was no central authority figure. Nobody arose who could really fill the shoes of Joshua after Joshua had died. Now, certainly, there were people who were influential. People like Deborah and Gideon and Samson spoke up and provided some leadership when the going got rough. But generally speaking, the people of Israel at this time didn't have a sense that they were under anybody's authority. It was something like anarchy. Everybody just did what was right in their own eyes. So how did we get to this point? How did it go from this kind of high point, at least from the Bible's perspective, of victories in the land of Canaan to this period of chaos? Well, the Bible describes it as something of a generational shift. And you might even say that privilege has something to do with it. Consider how it's described back in Judges chapter 2, where it says, "The whole generation was gathered to their ancestors, and another generation grew up after them, who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and worshiped the Baals. And they abandoned the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt." When you think about it, many generations back up to this time, the Israelites were almost in a constant state of crisis. They were in slavery in Egypt. Then they found themselves in the wilderness, depending on God on a daily basis for food. Then they found themselves in this new land, fighting for even a single scrap of territory to be able to live in. It was just this constant state of being faced with life or death kinds of situations. And then, for the first time, they succeed. They've settled. And all of a sudden, the generation that follows them isn't in that same crisis mode. They have inherited the kind of privilege of security. They're more comfortable. Not that they didn't have any problems of their own, but they weren't anywhere near on the same scale as their ancestors. And once you get in that kind of situation where you're comfortable and there's not as much crisis, it doesn't make as much sense. You don't feel as motivated to try to follow these laws down to the letter. It's not as important to try to live exactly in the way that God wants. You don't sense that you need God in the same way that you do in those moments of crisis. Another consequence that comes from escaping a moment, a time of crisis, is that you often lose your sense of solidarity with the other people in your community. Sociologists actually talk about solidarity as being this bond that forms between people who might not otherwise be connected, who might not otherwise feel a sense of care for one another or even be able to get along with one another. But because of a common suffering, they come together, they feel this deep sense of connection, and they really stick out for one another. But then oftentimes, when the crisis passes, that sense of solidarity begins to fade, and people start only showing interest in the people in their own immediate group, whether it's a group that has the same interests, the same identity, the same family heritage. Societies can easily descend into what we call tribalism. And in the case of the Israelites, that is quite literally what happened. They descended into a deeper sense of connection with their individual tribes and not the community as a whole. Now, you might recall back from our previous readings in Numbers, especially, that there were 12 tribes in Israel. And that, as you can see on this map, each tribe was supposedly assigned a particular territory that was supposed to be there. Now, before the people even crossed into the Jordan, there were 3 of the tribes, or 2.5 to be specific, that were to the east of the Jordan, the tribes of Manasseh and Gad and Reuben, that had already claimed their territory. And we might be a little uncomfortable with this ethic as it's presented in Joshua, but there's at least a sense of unity and bondedness here, right? So Moses tells these people, all right, you can have this land. It's not in the land of Israel proper, but you can have this land as long as you commit to fight with your sisters and brothers when the rest of them go into the remaining land of Israel. And they agreed. They said, okay, yeah, you're right. We're all one. We're one community. When the time comes, we will stick up for them. And sure enough, in the book of Joshua, they did exactly that. Even though they had settled and were more established, they came to assist their sisters and brothers in establishing these other tribes of Israel. But then we get to the book of Judges. And in the opening chapter, it's kind of trying to review the different things that had happened to all these 12 tribes. And there's a comment that it makes, a significant comment that's easy to miss. Apparently, one of the tribes, the tribe of Dan, had not actually been successful in securing the territory that Moses had envisioned for them. They were having trouble with their neighboring Philistines. They couldn't quite defeat them. And what's significant is that none of the other tribes come to the rescue of Dan. They're left to figure this out on their own, which ends up having significant consequences for the story that we heard read just a little while ago. And so this is where tribalism begins. People wonder, well, why should I stick my neck out for someone who's not even connected to me, people that I don't know or that I don't even like very much? And unfortunately, we see that this escalates as the book of Judges goes on. By the time we get to the middle of Judges, we go back to those tribes that are east of the Jordan River, which collectively are called Gilead. And these tribes of Gilead are having a conflict with their neighbors, the Ammonites. Now, because they had risked their necks to help all of their sisters and brothers, they expected that the Israelites would come back to help them. But they didn't. They were left on their own. Now, fortunately, they were able to ward off the attack. They were able to maintain their territory in these tribes. But they were so angry with the rest of the Israelites that they decided to start fortifying the Jordan River, building forts and checkpoints and making it so that the people of Israel were no longer allowed to come in their territory. They treated them as if they were enemies and threatened even to kill anybody who tried to cross into the land of Gilead if you were not a native Gileadite. Oof, intense. But unfortunately, it doesn't stop there. By the time we get to the end of the book of Judges, this tribalism unfolded into all-out war. This time focused on the tribe of Benjamin. Now, in the tribe of Benjamin, there's an egregious act that occurs in Israel, and all of the other Israelites are upset about it. But instead of trying to resolve it in some kind of a mature way, they simply go to war. And this is an ugly war. It's a war in which God is consulted in a few situations, but they never really seem to hear a clear answer from God that's helpful. And it seems to just get negative. Both sides lose a tremendous amount of people. There's nothing really good that comes out of it. And this seems to be ultimately where tribalism leads, to this unproductive, miserable outleash of violence. So this is one of the things that we see happening in the book of Judges. There's this kind of collective movement toward tribalism. But I also need to mention that there is a lot of individual moral depravity. I imagine that as some of you read through this book, you felt sick to your stomach at several points, because some of the most sickening stories are included in this book. We have, for example, one man, a son of Gideon, in fact, who wanted to inherit his father's role as the judge of Israel, or at least that region for a particular time. And so he gathers all of his sisters and brothers under the premise of having a family gathering, and while they're peaceably gathering, has them all killed, just so that he can be guaranteed to be the one who will inherit that power. In another story, we find about there's an enemy general who had clearly lost a battle with the Israelites and was on the run. He was fleeing, and a woman offers him refuge and hospitality in her tent, lures him to sleep, and then in his sleep, murders him in cold blood. And then we hear an even more troubling story about someone who's supposed to be a moral exemplar, one of the judges of the land of Israel, who offers his own daughter as a human sacrifice to God, despite the fact that God makes it very clear in the Mosaic Law that this is an utterly abominable and disgusting type of thing to do. We have these troubling events, some of which I didn't even name because, frankly, they're too graphic to describe on a Sunday morning. You think, how do we get to this place? Well, I want to go back to that verse in 17:6, the one that's often considered the summary verse for this section, because I think it does a good job of capturing what was going on here. It says, in those days, there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. Now, I think that's something that we should actually take literally. The idea that the people were trying to do what was right. It's not as though this was just an entire generation of people who had bad or selfish instincts, as though they were any worse than you or I was. It's just that they had no accountability. Their only moral compass was their own. And in fact, most of the depraved events that I described here in Judges, the individuals who committed them felt that they were justified, if not doing the right thing, in doing them. Because the human mind has a tendency to justify its ethics and its morality around what's convenient for us. This tendency is exasperated when we're in a society of tribalism in which the pressures and the voices of the various tribes incline to make us back off on our own discernment and just go with whatever the group around us is saying. It's a problem that happens when there is no authority or no king. Now, that might seem a little bit strange for us to hear them mention a lack of a king as being the source for kind of this moral chaos. We don't necessarily look to political leaders as being our moral leaders in today's day and age, but we live in a more complex society. At that time, there weren't these different institutions that existed. There wasn't like an educational institution, and then you have a religious institution where you could go to church or synagogue, and then separately there's a political institution. It was all wrapped up into one and the same. Think about Moses, right? He was the teacher and the prophet and the political leader of the people of Israel. Usually in each community, these kinds of powers were wrapped together. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that giving so much power to one individual is a good idea. As we will find out next week when we're reading Samuel, the Bible has some concerns about giving individuals, too much power too. But there's certainly a danger to be faced on the side of not acknowledging any kind of moral authority at all. It gets you into a place where everybody, even if they're trying to do the right thing, ends up just harming each other. And I think that the story that we read from Judges 17 and 18 is probably the best one in the book to illustrate this. Now, that story that Angie and crew read for us is not one that's very well known. You might not have even heard it before. It certainly doesn't appear in the children's books or movies in the Sunday school classes that we're used to. And I think that the reason for that is that there are no clear heroes in the story. I would argue that there's no clear villains either. But you just have a bunch of people who are kind of trying to do right and kind of doing things selfishly that end up hurting each other in a way that nobody wins, right? So we're introduced to a number of morally ambiguous characters, starting with Micah, who, by the way, is not to be confused with the prophet Micah, who writes the book of Micah long time later. This is a different Micah, right? So this guy named Micah, from the beginning, is introduced to us as an ambiguous character. He begins with this opening speech, where he said to his mother, "The 1,100 pieces of silver that were taken from you, about which you uttered a curse and even spoke it in my hearing, I will return to you." Now that just sounds chivalrous, right? Here's a guy, he's concerned about his mother. She's been cheated. He wants to do right by her, except there's this little point that he kind of mutters in the middle, represented by this ... And when you look at what it actually says, you find this. The 1,100 pieces of silver that were taken from you, about which you uttered a curse and even spoke in my hearing, that silver is in my possession. I took it, but now I will return it to you, right? So here's a guy who stole from his own mother. That's not necessarily a morally admirable characteristic. But on the other hand, he does seem to be trying to do the right thing. He's trying to return it to her, so I guess we should give him credit. Maybe we're more drawn to Micah's mother then as a moral figure than we are to him. So if we look at this next section, when you have Micah's mother, she responds so gracefully to him, right? First, she blesses him. Oh, bless you, my son, for returning this money. And then she makes this great pious statement where she says, I consecrate the silver to the Lord from my hand for my son. What a wonderful woman to be able to dedicate things to God. Except not quite, because then when you read the rest of that statement a little bit more, you find that it goes on to say this. I consecrate the silver to make an idol of cast metal. Now remember, idolatry didn't always mean that the Israelites were worshiping other gods. Sometimes they created an idol as a way to create a physical representation of Yahweh, whom they wanted to worship. But this was still absolutely forbidden by the Ten Commandments, and pretty well known as one of the things that you're not supposed to do. We also find that there might have been some extra financial motives for the mother saying this. She was probably dependent on her son for her financial situation. There's no husband who's mentioned in this story. And she might have known that he had stolen it from her, so she issues this curse, which would apply to her too, and now she has to issue a blessing to kind of cancel it out. And then when she donates the money to this idol that, again, you're not supposed to make, theoretically to worship God, it just so happens that this idol makes its way into Micah's household. It's not given to some other religious community. And the significance of that, especially with an idol as expensive and therefore elaborate as this one, is that people would come to see it. People put a lot of faith and value in these things. So you might have pilgrims who would come from the surrounding region because they wanted to get some kind of a blessing for something they were trying to do. And they thought that maybe God would be more likely to hear them in the face of this idol or image made in God's image. So you could actually profit from having this kind of thing in your home. And Micah seemed to be really excited about this project, probably thought that he was truly honoring God in the process. And, what's the harm in making a little money if you're trying to honor God? And so he invests in these other things too. He invests in what the text calls teraphim, which are other idols of maybe lesser gods, to just round out the whole thing, make sure anybody who wants to visit is covered. He gets an ephod, which is kind of the official vestment that a priest would wear. And he assigns his son to be like the priest who oversees this holy and solemn shrine that he has now created in his house. Now, his son didn't have any kind of formal training. He wasn't a religious figure. And so one could very easily question the legitimacy of this, but it was better to have something than nothing, right? And then we have our third ambiguous character who comes along. Much to Micah's pleasure, it's the Levite who is mentioned next. And here we see that the Levite, when he's asked, who are you? What are you doing? He says, I'm a Levite of Bethlehem in Judah, and I'm going to live wherever I can find a place. So he's kind of this religious free agent. He's a Levite. He has the ancestry of Aaron. And so, he can claim to be a religiously authoritative figure, but he's not attached anywhere. And Micah jumps on him. He's very excited about this, and he uses this as an opportunity to get him working in his shrine at his household. And then finally, he's got the Levite, he's got the idol, he's got all the other idols. He's very excited about how this situation has worked out. And he says in satisfaction at the end of the chapter that God has blessed him. And you can see here in verse 13, then Micah said, now I know that the Lord will prosper me, because the Levite has become my priest. And the scary thing is, he really believes that. He really thinks that God is behind him, that God was doing all these things, even though he never once consulted God, at least in a sincere way. And he actually did things that were clearly in violation of the teaching that God had offered to the people through the Mosaic law. Well, the story doesn't end there. We are introduced to one more morally ambiguous character, in this case, a group of people, the Danites. Now, remember that I mentioned way back in Judges chapter 1, nobody came to help the Danites when they were having trouble securing their territory. And so eventually, apparently, they just gave up. They stopped trying to get this difficult land that was right there on the border of the Philistines. And they said, you know what? These Israelites, they're not our brothers and sisters. They're our enemies. So they sent out spies into the land of Israel in the hopes of finding some weak territories in Israel that they could capture and claim as their own. And in the process of sending out these spies, someone comes across Micah's household and this fancy shrine and everything that he'd set up, and they think, oh, you know what? That's nice. We're going to take that. And so they send these men to this shrine. They encounter the Levite, who's a wandering Levite, and he says, hey, what are you guys doing? And they say, we're taking this. And guess what? The Levite who came off the street, whom you paid in order to work for you, didn't turn out being that loyal in the end. He just immediately switched his religious allegiance and became the religious supporter of the Danites now instead of the religious supporter of Micah and his family. Well, Micah is very disturbed by this. He finds that these people are coming to his house and stealing this shrine, this idol that he built his entire life around. And so he runs and he tries to catch up with them. And he asks them, who do you think you are? What are you doing? You have no right to take this from me. But at this point, what does right mean in their society anyway? The Danites just said to him, you'd better not let your voice be heard among us, or else hot-tempered fellows will attack you, and you will lose your life and the lives of your household. They didn't even try to provide some kind of moral justification for it. At this point, it was just pure power. We are going to hurt you if you don't give us what we want. And unfortunately, that's where this kind of acting in your own eyes ultimately leads. And there's this tragic moment at the very end of this section that we read, where Micah realizes that God wasn't actually behind him at all, that this was his own doing. As verse 26 says, when Micah saw that they were too strong for him, he turned and went back to his home. Now, I find this to be a very sobering book, a very sobering story. And while it might not be one of the highlights in the story of the Bible, I think that it has a lot of application for us and the society that we live in today. Because many of us find ourselves having been born into a situation of privilege, at least greater privilege than the generations that had come before us. That's not true of every individual in this room, but it's probably true of Mennonites as a whole, at least, who had a history of being persecuted deeply for their beliefs, and now we can practice them somewhat freely and comfortably. We live in a society in which there's not a clear sense of moral authority. People instead find themselves falling into tribalism. They're this group versus this group. And it's hard to find any way of making that better. And unfortunately, I'm not just talking about tribalism in terms of the United States on a large scale, but even within the church, even within the Mennonite church, it feels at times like everyone is just doing what's right in their own eyes. And truth be told, I don't trust myself in this period of time. When I'm just trying to make these moral decisions, I know that I am susceptible to being influenced to what actually benefits me, or to what my tribe is yelling that I ought to be doing. And it's hard to really sort out right and wrong. Which is why it is so important for us as God's people to center ourselves on a moral authority that's bigger than us. I have to say, I found at one point in my life that I was a wandering Levite. I wasn't attached to any community necessarily. And so I wanted to attach myself to the Mennonite church because it represented a community that has gone back for generations, that has a moral vision that predates the debates and challenges going on in our own society, and that decides together as a community what we believe is right. The moral authority can be found there. Now, we're struggling even now as a Mennonite church to be able to make those decisions together, which is why I think it's so important for us to turn to the Bible. Because if there's not some kind of common basis, some kind of common set of values, then a community can't come together. So part of the reason that we look to this strange and ancient book for guidance, a book that even at times there are things that make us uncomfortable, that we don't necessarily agree with, is because it's a way of submitting ourselves to something beyond ourselves. Looking to the Bible and its story as our guide, so that with the help of our sisters and brothers in Christ, may we not just be doing what is right in our own eyes, but what's right in God's eyes as well.